Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I am Evan Axelbank, and today we will speak with the author of Team of Five, The President's Club in the Age of Trump, author Kate Brower. This is her fourth book on the American presidency. She's a CNN contributor and has worked for Bloomberg News, the New York Times, and Washington Post, among others. So thanks so much for being here, Ms. Brower.
Thanks for having me, Evan.
If I may call you Kate, is that okay?
Yes, please.
All right, good. Kate has had she has the fortunate or unfortunate position of being on our first show, depending on how all of this goes. So that means we're going to take a quick detour right here before we start our conversation with her. And I just want to use that detour to just say I'm starting this podcast because there's a need to make history accessible to everyone. Over the course of developing my obsessive hobby of reading books on American history, alongside my career as a TV reporter, I decided the more we know about history, the better choices we will make for our future. So thanks so much for listening to this first installment. And let me say I am thrilled for my first guest to be an author of presidential history, because that really is my favorite kind of history. So Kate, welcome aboard as our test case.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
And sadly, we're going to be constrained by the time limits of an episode. I could probably talk to you for hours here. But first of all, The President's Club, not the title of your book I'm speaking here, but just in practice. Do the four living ex-presidents see themselves as members of an official club, or do they have a loose association with one another?
They have a loose association with one another. I mean, they do all follow these unwritten rules of, not weighing in on the sitting president. As often as they can, they are restrained. But it's not like, they're not all on a text chain together, right? That was my hope going into it, that it was a little bit more formal. But it's loose, but they do respect one another. And even when, after Clinton beat George H.W. Bush, there was kind of a grudging admiration that the two men had for each other. And I go into that in the book.
I guess it sort of would have been a dream for you if one of them said, "Oh, I actually have a text message chain right here that I can share." Right? That would have made the research.
That would have been amazing. In fact, one of Obama's advisors, it's sort of one of my earliest calls, I explained what I was working on, and he said, this would be a great work of fiction, but the actual reality of it is that they don't, all get on a conference call every day and decide how to respond to Trump, but they do. Their aides do, like their staffs are very much in touch with one another.
That's interesting. So one of the things about the presidents is that they're sort of a constant presence for us, whether they're in office or not. They're sort of always looming over whatever is happening in America. And people think about, oh, I remember what Obama was like, or I wonder what George Bush would have done at this moment. So one of the things is, so many of them are alive right now because presidents are living longer, just because I think, they have access to great healthcare, and healthcare and medicine has generally gotten better. But just a few years ago, there were five presidents living together. So just explain, if you can, how unusual it is for us to have so many presidents alive at once.
I mean, there have only been 4 periods when 5 former presidents were alive. So, before George H.W. Bush passed away, and what he's referred to as Bush 41 because he's the 41st president, that was a great opportunity for the current president to reach out to them because there were so many still alive. But going back in history, when Lyndon Johnson died in 1973, Richard Nixon was only the 6th living president to have no former presidents to ask for advice. So you think, and of course, I'm including George Washington in that lineup, right? But
Right.
The idea that Nixon couldn't, during Watergate, really reach out to anybody and ask for guidance. Now, I'm not sure if Nixon would have, right? But the sense that there is this, and this because you're a student of history, and you're really, you've obviously read quite a bit. JFK asked all of his living predecessors during the Cuban Missile Crisis for their advice during those 13 days. And you can actually go to the Kennedy Library's website, and you see the dates at which he called the former presidents who were still living at the time. So when he called Eisenhower, for instance, it's just a fascinating thing that they reach out to each other, because it's like any job, right? You would want to find out the person who had the job before you, if you could contact them, what were some things they could have done better, and what are some pitfalls, and I think that that's been really powerful in our history.
And that might be good advice for all of us. We should think about calling the people
Mhm.
more often who have expertise that we may not yet or are seeking to have. And those recordings are highly recommended. Some of them, when Kennedy
Mhm.
calls Eisenhower general, and he's always barking into the phone. It is fantastic. I think
Yeah.
there's one call where you can hear Kennedy actually trying to like urge Eisenhower off the phone, like, "Yep,
Yeah,
okay."
yeah, yeah, right, right.
um,
I mean, think of how much Kennedy had to sort of, especially after the Bay of Pigs, which, Eisenhower had ordered that operation, and then it goes terribly wrong, and Eisenhower's like, kind of, you listen to the recording where he's like, well, you did it, you should have listened, you didn't do what I would have done. And it's like Kennedy's probably thinking, you were the person who got me into this mess. It's fascinating listening to those calls.
The book begins with your meeting with the current president, and when the book came out, this made some news. But I thought it was ironic that you set the scene that way, because he was elected by people who very much wanted him to break the norms of the office, and so much of this club is about those norms. And you ask him whether he would attend President Obama's library open if former President Obama invited him, and without a hint of being bothered, President Trump not only said President Obama probably wouldn't invite him, but agreed it would probably be weird for him to do so. So, how did the exchange hit you? And I guess I would also ask: do you think President Obama, former President Obama, would invite President Trump to something like that? Does he see such a duty to this club that he would make that invitation? So, anyway, your thoughts on that exchange?
Yeah, I mean, that's I that the latter part of that, I've always been fascinated by, thinking of that, whether Obama would invite him. When I was sitting across from Trump, he was sitting at the Resolute desk, and the president was very engaged in our conversation. He was leaning forward, kind of squinting his eyes, like really drilling down into what I was asking, which I was very happy about. He wanted to talk about this, but he was also very blunt. And as you say, when I asked him, how does he think he'll fit into the president's club? He kind of laughed and he said, not very well.
I don't want
What
to
do you
be in that club, right?
right? Like, what do you think? What a question. And then when I asked about President Obama's library opening, he kind of jutted his chin out and sort of mulled it over, and then he said, well, why would he even invite me? And I think that does get to the heart of the issue, is that, first of all, I think Obama would invite him, because I think that that's just part of tradition. Sometimes I think when Trump isn't included, like with John McCain's funeral, it becomes about Donald Trump. And I know that the Bush family really wanted him to come to Bush 41's funeral, because they didn't want it to become like a sideshow of why he wasn't invited. So I think Obama would invite him. And I think that Trump, I think he might actually go, even though he says he wouldn't, because he wants to be part of this club. I think deep down, he feels like he's been ostracized by them. And that's why he hits back so hard at them on Twitter. It's like he feels like, he's been bullied almost, which is ironic, because that's not the way that most people see it. But he told me that he thinks Jimmy Carter has been unfairly treated by the former presidents as well. And that he, sees himself kind of like Carter as an outsider, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, and I do have a couple of questions I want to ask you about that a little bit later. But yeah, Jimmy Carter has always sort of seemed to have
Mhm.
um, maybe difficult, you would say, relationships with other former presidents. But before we get to some of that, I do want to ask. The second chapter of the book is about the unwritten rules of the club, and one of the things I want to do with this episode here is just explain what you mean by that. And so, you say there is no clubhouse for the men who were once the most powerful people in the world, but there is a very strict understanding among them. And one of the rules is that you write here is honor a shared history. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's that sense of empathy that they have for one another. And I get into, the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and how they were bitter rivals. And, Adams didn't even go to Jefferson's inauguration, and he left him this terse note saying, how many horses were in the stable at the White House. It was very tense and difficult. And then, in their later years, they famously forged this friendship and sent letters back and forth to each other for years, and died the same day within hours of each other, on the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, an incredible story. Um, and I think that we see this sense that they can all get over their losses, and more recently, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, a shared history of being president, a shared history of interest in the presidency. Most of them have read about former presidents, and most, Bill Clinton had stacks of books and just voraciously read about the men who came before him. And so that's what I mean by that. And I think that Trump is certainly an outlier there. He is not as curious about the men who came before him.
I think, is there also a sense that they sort of can't believe they're living this life? I mean, we all know who the presidents are. And, I got that sense from Bill Clinton suddenly having access to Richard Nixon, who was at one time, he and Hillary Clinton's nemesis. And all of a sudden they're in this same club, and Bill Clinton can just pick up the phone and call him. I think they seem to really sort of kind of can't
Yeah.
believe that they're in that situation.
Yeah, I think there is kind of a sense of disbelief, right? That you've reached this peak and that you have one. And then I think it's fascinating, and I get into it in the book, the idea that these former presidents then are desperately like Nixon, trying to be influential again. And there's one point where Nixon, calls up a Clinton advisor and threatens to write a negative op-ed if they don't let him talk to Clinton, right then. It's this sort of sense of reaching that height, and you're never going to get higher than the becoming president. And then abruptly your life changes. And there's a great story of Harry Truman when he moves back to independence, and someone says, "What are you going to do now?" And he says, "Take the grips up to the attic." He's going to just unfold, take his clothes out of the suitcases. This idea that they're suddenly semi-private citizens, I think, is fascinating.
Yeah, and one of the things in presidential history is that there's always an aide who's watching as the person goes from being an ordinary citizen to becoming president, and they see the counter assault team show up, and the people with the rifles show up, and the Secret Service. There's suddenly the nuclear football and all these other things. They really do, in some ways, become more than just a person, and then they sort of go back to that life. And one of the quotes you have in the book is, "There's nothing more pathetic in life than a former president." I think John Quincy Adams, right?
Mm-hmm.
What did he mean? And they often say, "I don't want to talk about what's going on publicly," and there's kind of an understanding that they not talk about publicly, their opinions on things, and then they sometimes decide to. So explain that kind of unwritten rule.
I think they feel tremendous pressure not to. And this is a relatively new, not to weigh in on what's going on after they leave office. It's a relatively new rule. I mean, you go back and look at Teddy Roosevelt, who, of course, ran against Taft and his handpicked successor. He criticized him and criticized Woodrow Wilson publicly when Wilson was president. And there have been many times where Bill Clinton was critical of the war in Iraq, for instance. And so there have been times where they have weighed in, but I think they mostly try to stay on the sidelines and not do that. And I think that a lot of that is the precedent set by George H.W. Bush, and they particularly feel that pressure now. I know from my reporting that, President Trump has made it so that if they do weigh in, it's kind of seen as a rallying he can use that against them. When Obama speaks out against Trump, I think it does help Trump kind of get his base excited, and it mobilizes his base. And so there's a sense now it's just, we're so divided. And, I think that it's become even harder for the former presidents to to weigh in and to sort of be above the fray. They really can't be above politics, especially not now.
And sometimes we do see them speak out, particularly at political conventions. And there's always this question of like, how much is what they say going to matter? Bill Clinton certainly had a long influence at political conventions,
Mhm.
um, from his, starting in 2004, his first president or his first convention not being president or the nominee. And I think it was a dozen years. Um, do they try to keep themselves relevant, or are they okay in understanding that over time my influence will wane?
I mean, just looking at the cover of my book, which has all the, five former presidents when Bush was alive at the time, and this was in 2009 when Obama was first elected, and there he's there with Bush, with both Bushes, and with Clinton and Carter. And I can tell you, it took a long time to get this photo because all of the shots are of Carter kind of standing off to the side, and because he wasn't in the frame and he was awkwardly kind of standing away from the other former presidents. And that is because of his insistence on weighing in. He has been outspoken, and that's damaged his relationships with these men. I mean, I talk about in the book when he went to Haiti, there was a military coup, and he's in Haiti and he's trying to help, and he takes a CNN crew with him and does an interview with CNN before in telling Clinton what happened. And Clinton, is just furious about that. And I mean, Carter does not play by the rules. And I think we've seen that he's paid a price for that. And, I've interviewed him, and I don't think he much cares what they think of him, really. In the same way that, Trump says he doesn't care either. They actually do have that in common.
uh, Bill Clinton, and he seems to come up a lot, I think, because he just loves being part of everything all the time. But one of the things that we've seen is that his influence has lasted, whereas George W. Bush's influence
Mm,
was up almost right away the moment he left office, because he left office during a financial crisis, and people were still and are
mhm.
to this day angry about the Iraq War. Do you think George W. Bush was or is disappointed about that?
I think George W. Bush is, polling better than he ever would have dreamed, in his wildest dreams. I think he and Laura Bush went to Dallas, and they call Texas, the promised land. They're going home to the promised land. They're in Crawford and Dallas, and they're enjoying their lives. And, I interviewed his best friend who said, look, he spends his time painting and riding his bike and little league baseball. Like
Do you
he
think
is
he's more
happy in
disappointed though
retirement.
than he's let on? Do you think he's more disappointed than he lets on?
I think he is disappointed with the fact that the Republican Party has changed so much. And we know, there have been recent reports that he's not going to vote for Trump. And I would be surprised if he voted for Biden. I think there's a difference between expressing your distaste in Donald Trump and then saying you're going to suddenly become a Democrat. When your family is a Republican dynasty and you have a nephew like George P. Bush, who has just endorsed Trump. I mean, there's a legacy there, but I think that Bush is very saddened by what's happened, and I know he's compared what's going on now with the Civil War, and has told friends, if we could get through the Civil War, we can get through the Trump presidency. And I think that says a lot about where his head is at, and he tries to change the subject at every turn when he's asked about Donald Trump.
Interesting. A lot of my questions so far have been about the former presidents and how they talk to one another, and why they do when they do. But Donald Trump has not asked for much help at all during the day-to-day decision making. I think you had one tidbit in there about a phone call to Jimmy Carter that I think ended pretty quickly, and Carter didn't say a whole lot about it. Why do you think that Donald Trump has not done more to reach out to his predecessors?
Well, and I just add with the Bush, your question about Bush was interesting because look, he absence does make the heart grow fonder. And I would just say that former presidents are wise to not speak out, because people respect when they stay on the sidelines. Um, but I think Trump can't reach out to these former presidents, because he has this kind of view that the presidency and the campaigns are this blood sport. He has gotten to where he is by burning these bridges. And I asked him if he could see himself becoming friends with any of them, and he said anything's possible. And then he talked about both Clintons coming to his wedding to Melania, and the
He's very
sense that,
proud of that. He's very proud of the fact that they were
oh,
at that wedding.
yes, it was funny because he said, "I don't know if you've seen the photo." And I said, "Oh, of course. Everybody in the world has seen that photo." And I did not realize that Hillary sat in the front pew at the actual ceremony in the church, though. That's really interesting to me. I mean, it's just kind of phony, on both sides, right? I try not to be partisan at all in these books, but like, it does make both sides look bad, that there was an exchange of influence and power for money that Trump then donated to the Clintons.
And then
Um,
use that in the campaign to say, look how much I know about it, about
yes,
the process.
Yes. I mean, the whole thing is really distasteful. And I do think that Carter does come across, and the Bushes actually they come across looking pretty good, because especially Carter, because it's not all about money. And I have a chapter in the book called Cashing In.
Yeah,
And
and
this,
we are going to get to that because that's a big
yeah,
part of being an ex-president.
yes, it's not pretty, I don't think.
Certainly the presidents of the 1700s or the 1800s would say, "Wow, you're making a lot of money these days."
Yeah.
Before we get to that, though, I do want to ask a couple of things about some behind the scenes stuff. So one of the things I love about your books is they get into these very awkward plane rides that they have, or at least the ones that start awkward and end up not as awkward. They often go and do fundraising things together on the helicopter and what have you. Um, uh, you write a lot about relationships that are sort of hard to see coming sometimes. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. Um, Give me just some behind the scenes type things about how these relationships developed and what sort of happened, if you want to start with Ford and Carter, that made them, from political opponents to friends.
I mean, Ford and Carter is especially interesting because, when Ford lost, he was so upset that Betty Ford had to step in. His voice was too hoarse and he was emotional and overcome, so that Betty Ford had to step in and give his, uh, resignation. I mean, when he basically acknowledged that he had lost, because that whole thing played out over all night long. No one knew who officially won, and Ford was holding out hope. And so their relationship was not good at all, because Ford had never been elected. He was the accidental president. He kind of ended up with the presidency. He desperately, I think, wanted to be elected. They were devastated when they lost. And then Carter comes in, and Ford actually, I dug up this old story that he had criticized Carter for his handling of inflation at the time. And so he didn't always bite his tongue. And then these two men are sent by Reagan, to Cairo after Sadat was assassinated. And it is an incredible trip where Nixon is there with them. Mrs. Carter is there also, and they take this long plane ride, and there's a discussion about what they should all call each other. And should they call each other Mr. President or just their first names? I think they decided on the first names, and who should go in first to the plane. I mean, there's all this formality, and I think Nixon was the one who said it should be the person should be the person who just, was most recently in office. But it's incredible to think of these three former presidents sitting
And
together
always,
on a
yeah, and always following this sort of ceremonial thing.
plane.
Okay, who goes first? Who goes second? Okay, let's do it by administration order.
Yes.
Um, Another fascinating relationship, Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon. I remember a quote from Bill Clinton saying when Richard Nixon passed away, I felt like my own father had died. They
Mm,
went from opponents in so many ways, both during Watergate with Hillary working, on the
yes.
team trying to convict him, And then politically, they had different ideas. And here is Bill Clinton calling Richard Nixon his own father,
Mhm.
or the father he never had, even. So anyway, Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton, fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it is really fascinating that I think again it goes to the sense that Clinton respected Nixon's intellect, his opening up of relations with China. So, at Nixon's funeral, Clinton spoke and talked about, we should not look at Nixon's life in through the lens of this one event, right? Which I think that the subtext there, now this was well before Monica Lewinsky, but Whitewater and a lot of scandals were engulfing the White House really from day one when Clinton was in office. And I think that the subtext of what Clinton was saying was, look at Nixon for the good that he did as well as the bad. And I think Clinton, in a self-serving way, wants people to look at his presidency and his legacy that way too. So there is again like this shared sense of there are only a few people who know the pressures that these people,
Hmm.
the presidents face, and so I think there was an emotion there. I think Nixon's funeral, I thought, was really actually very emotional.
The word I'm thinking of is empathy. These
Hmm.
presidents seem to develop empathy for their predecessors. We all might if we knew what it was like to be to be president.
Yes.
Um, Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. Talk about that scene on the plane. I think they're on the way to fundraise in after the tsunami, and
Yeah.
there's only one bed, and Bill Clinton offers the bed, as we all probably would, to the elder statesman, and that was seen as sort of a moment where they mended a rift that had developed.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't know what to make either. And I interviewed Alan Simpson, who was the senator who was friendly with both of them. And he said both of them called him separately before they went on that trip to Asia after the tsunami, which was really the moment that their relationship began, and said, what do you think? Like, what's he like? And so they both called Simpson asking for advice. And because I think that you forget that the 92 election was hard fought, and they did say pretty damning things about one another, including Bush, calling out Clinton for not serving in Vietnam. And I think there was a lot of bad blood there. And then they came together at George W. Bush's suggestion. And I know that before Bush passed away, Clinton was just incredibly distraught. And the last time he saw him, he was crying and said, I think, told his friend, I don't think I'm going to ever see him again. And I mean, just Clinton didn't have a stable father figure. His biological father died before he was born. In a car crash, and then his stepfather was abusive and an alcoholic. And I mean, so he looked at Bush really like a surrogate dad, and that is a very real and touching relationship.
And the family made fun of them for that
Yeah. Yes.
frequently. What did they
Yeah.
say? The
Brother from another mother. Brother from another mother. Yeah.
let's also talk about George W. Bush and Michelle Obama. Not necessarily, not exactly a presidential relationship, but certainly close enough, and one that has really gotten a lot of press and people seem to love. Why do people love that so much?
Well, I think especially now, it shows that you can have this friendship that is based solely on personality versus politics or gender or race. I mean, I was interested that when I was sort of digging into that photo of the Smithsonian African American Museum, the famous photo where Michelle Obama's got her arms wrapped around Bush and he's kind of leaning in and smiling, and it's very sweet. And I learned that a lot of that, while it is genuine, is also for show. I mean, they want people to see that, and they're very aware. Both Bush and Michelle Obama, are incredibly, smart people, and they want the cameras to capture those moments because they believe that it's important to send that message now more
They
than ever.
understand that people will see that the candy being given to her. George W.
Yeah.
hands the pieces of candy, and he did it one time totally for show at his own father's funeral.
Hmm.
So they understand those images then.
Yes, very much so. And that's not to take away from the importance of them, but I think that it also, they understand the power of that, message. And I think that's also why, I think Obama would invite Donald Trump to his presidential library opening. I think that's why the Bushes invited Trump to Bush's funeral. The sense is there is a protocol here, and none of these former presidents is willing to step away from it. I mean, the person who would be Donald Trump, right? He's the one that doesn't care as much about institutions and
He might get his power from that too. That
yeah.
might be his internal strength.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Bucking that and being this disruptor has been his greatest strength. And so, like you said earlier, why would he want to conform when it's worked for him not to conform?
Right. It made him president.
Yeah.
Uh, they all seem to miss it, and I would say maybe with the exception of George W. Bush, who doesn't seem to regret the fact that he's no longer in power. But we could certainly debate that. What does it say about the kind of person who seeks power, for all the pain and the grief and the work schedule that being president is, and the criticism that they take? What kind of person would miss that?
I know it's hard to imagine wanting that job, right? I think it's just the ego. I mean, I hate to say it, they all do share that tremendous ego. And you can like them or not, but and my favorite story in the book, by the way, is of Obama in Bush 41, right before Bush dies. The last president Bush sees is Barack Obama, not Bill Clinton or his own son, which I think is incredible. But even Bush 41, somebody who's very, gentlemanly and you wouldn't think had an enormous ego. I mean, he does, right? Who wants this?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Who wants this? Right.
I mean, and it's 24 hours a day, and you get woken up with literally a problem that is life or death, and then you spend 8 years, if you have it your way, you spend 8 years doing it, and then they all get out of office, and the first thing Bill Clinton says is, "I miss the work." And
Yeah.
Barack Obama would like another shot at a couple of things right now. And to this day, Jimmy Carter, who I believe slept in the Oval Office on the last night he was in office. They don't want to let go.
They don't, and it's the adrenaline. And when Obama was negotiating his deal for his book, he talks about how his agent said, "Oh, the publisher will, we'll talk to the editors soon." And Obama said, "Okay, well, I can talk to them this afternoon or tomorrow morning." And his agent said, "No, I'm thinking next week." And Obama says something like, "For me, decisions were life and death, and they had to be made right then. Like next week is an eternity from now to a president." And I think they get hooked. I mean, they're like addicted to the adrenaline and the power. I mean, Bill Clinton barely slept, and they feed off of that. It's
Calling
interesting.
people at 4 a.m. and 3 a.m.
Yeah.
Donald Trump too doesn't sleep, although I guess he didn't sleep before this. But
Right.
so you mentioned this before, but we have to talk about it because it has become such a big part of the ex-presidency. And that is the money that they make. Now, look, we're sitting here with a couple of reporters here. So you and I both, would look at a $400,000 a year job and go, my goodness, this is a well-paying job by almost any
Yeah.
standard.
Yeah.
And most Americans would, 99% of Americans would. But it's probably, even with that big salary, probably the greatest ratio of money that one can make if you compare pre-retirement and post-retirement. I mean, they go from making 400 grand a year to 400 grand a day, plus
Yes.
the books. So first of all, is that appropriate? And I don't know I want you to take a position if you're not comfortable doing so, but a lot of people would ask that question. So let me ask that. How do we deal with this idea that presidents leave office and make all of this money?
I think that a lot of them would say that they do a lot of good with it. Like they point to their charity work and this and that, but it does make you wonder how much is too much. And then also, I mean, Obama himself has said, "How nice a car can you have? How nice a, house can you?"
He also says, excuse me for interrupting you, but he also says,
Yeah.
"I can't believe how much money I've got."
No, and but they are fighting tooth and nail for it. It's not like he's not they, and I think that he would say, why shouldn't we have a $60 million book contract? Why other people have benefited, and I know the Clintons are famous for the amount of money they've made. And Bill Clinton's, in one speech when Hillary was Secretary of State, he made $500,000 for one speech. I mean, this is a couple hours of your time. And I think people, when the average salary in this country is like 50 grand for a family of four or something, I think they are looking at that and aghast. I see why. And I think that, someone like Jimmy Carter, who idolized Harry Truman, as you know, and Truman is someone who just really bristled at the idea of making money.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you to tell the Penn story, because that Penn story is great. Tell that.
Yeah, I mean, so he when Truman left office, there was no Secret Service, there was no pension. He had to make money selling his memoirs, and he was so worried about people thinking that he was trying to make money that he wouldn't use brand name pens when he was signing books, because he didn't want people to think he was endorsing the company that made the pen. And now, since Gerald Ford started joining corporate boards and making so much money, presidents are, signing deals with Netflix. They are making millions and millions off of books that they'll never be able to make. I mean, I know that Michelle Obama's book is, probably one of the best-selling books of all time. So maybe she'll make that back. But the idea that anybody could earn an advance of $30 million or something, that's a lot of books, and it's that's a lot. So they're trading on the prestige and the access, and I think it's I think it's a bit distasteful just because of the sheer amount of money and when is it enough. And I think that it really hurt Hillary Clinton, frankly, in 2016, because
Goldman Sachs, yeah.
yeah, people don't want to see that. And Obama did it too. He did some speeches after he left the White House to some banks, and it just looks bad. And it's also, I don't know why they do it, because they don't need to do it.
And these are not people afraid of public speaking. I mean, why should they make $500,000 to give a speech? I mean, it's not like this is heavy labor to them. They've got someone to write it. All they got to do is show up and read it.
Right. I mean, but human nature, I guess, you just want to, and that's why I think Carter is so fascinating, because he's written more than 30 books, but his net worth is well under $10 million. He's in that kind of zone of, he's wealthy, but he is not uber rich. And he has done so much good with the Carter Center. You can debate his presidency. A lot of people would say he was not a successful president, but he's done a lot. He's eradicated diseases. No other president can say that they've done that. And so I think he's kind of the model that it would be nice if more people followed that model.
How about George W. Bush and AIDS? He might take some credit for that in Africa.
Yeah, no, he would. Yeah, he should. And PEPFAR, I mean, that program is, both Democrats and Republicans praise it. And it's what an example of compassionate conservatism, at work that we don't see anymore, really. So yeah, he's done a lot of good, and he's also fought to keep funding for that program after he left office, and he's been successful in keeping funding. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's extra. It was an extraordinary program.
Yeah.
Give us a blow by blow of what President Obama said to George H.W. Bush, as much as you know here. On that last visit, I remember there was a brief press release President Obama put out. He just visited George H.W. Bush. Tell us how that all went down.
Well, I mean, that we don't know what they actually said to each other in private, because they had a few minutes where they were alone. But, Obama was in Houston 3 days before Bush passed away, and it was a meeting that had been set up months in advance. And I interviewed the Bush's chief of staff, who described how really tough it was that day and how Bush was not doing well. And she turned to Obama when he arrived and whispered, if it was anyone other than you, we would have canceled this meeting today. But it meant so much to Bush for Obama to come. And it was Bush, John Meacham, the historian, and who's very close with the Bush family, and Neil Bush, who I interviewed for the book, one of the Bush's sons. They were there, and they all sat together. Bush 41 was in his wheelchair, wasn't able to speak very much, but he was listening to the conversation. And they, at the end of about 45 minutes, Obama asked if he could have a few minutes alone with Bush Sr. And Neil said that, he's sure that they talked about foreign policy, and that Obama probably praised his father for his grace and dignity.
And
And we've heard.
sober leadership. Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, it's a heartfelt meeting because I think it's unexpected. I mean, it certainly wasn't the last interaction I expected to hear. Definitely expected that Bush 43, his son, would be the last president to see him. And I asked Bush's spokesman why he wasn't. And Bush's spokesman said, that he had said goodbye so many times to his father before, that there were so many times they thought he was going to pass away. So, they just didn't know that this would actually be the time. And Bill Clinton, too. I think I would have expected it to be Bill Clinton. But Obama, this person separated by decades and race and politics, to have that kind of mutual admiration for each other. I think it's just important to think about a little bit when things are so divided.
Yeah. One of the reasons we all love the President's Club. All right. I've got 3 sort of rapid fire questions here for you. Does the future of the President's Club depend on whether Donald Trump participates in it?
No, I don't think they need him to be part of it. He's an outlier. And I think if Biden is elected, which we don't know, but he would fit in very well because he's someone who has these relationships and he follows these rules pretty well. Yeah. So no.
Will Donald Trump invite Barack Obama to see his portrait unveiled?
No, and that's already been reported that he will not, and so that's kind of incredible to me. So no.
And some of those events that we saw between the Clintons and the Bushes, and then the Bushes and the Obamas, that was really great, made for TV, and I think a phenomenal opportunity for Americans to watch some have at least a healing moment.
Yes. And, there's a great story, and I could just quickly say that when the Bushes came, Michelle Obama took her staff aside and said, we need to make this the best day for the Bush family. And so they had this big lunch with 14 members of the Bush family in the Red Room of the White House. And she brought them to meet all the resident staffers who had worked for them when they were in the White House. So yes, I agree. It's a real made for TV moment.
It was beautiful moments, and they give funny speeches during those too. I'm sorry we're not going to get to see one anytime soon. Yeah. Last one. Has a former president, and we touched on this just a hair, has a former president ever endorsed the opponent of a member of the same party? So in other words, the question is, would George W. Bush ever actually endorse Joe Biden, and has that ever happened?
That's a great question. My belief is that George W. Bush wouldn't endorse Joe Biden because, in 2016 we did not hear George W. Bush endorse Hillary Clinton, although reportedly George H.W. Bush voted for Hillary Clinton, which is kind of incredible. And Barbara Bush wrote in Jeb Bush, which is also incredible.
And yeah, you can't blame her for writing her own son's name in.
That's true. But it's amazing to think here's this Republican dynasty, the leaders of the dynasty, and neither of them are voting for the Republican candidate. And so I think but I would be stunned if Bush endorsed Biden because of like I was saying earlier, George P. Bush, a member of the Bush family, has endorsed Trump, and he's in politics, and there's just too much. I think it would require him to really go out on a limb to do that.
Yeah. So I did read that the president's team is desperately hoping that George W. endorses Joe Biden. Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think that probably won't happen. So anyway, I knew this was going to happen. I knew this was going to go much longer than I ever thought it would, because I just can't resist a good presidential discussion, and we've got the absolute expert in presidential history here and right now. So I want to end this with a quote, though, which is from Harry Truman. When you get to be president, there are all those things, the honors, the 21 gun salutes, and you have to remember it isn't for you. And you have that in the book.
I love that quote too. So yeah, I mean, that just says it. That says it all. It's not for you. And I think that some presidents struggle with that more than others.
Yeah. No names.
Yeah.
Kate Brower, author of Team of Five, The President's Club in the Age of Trump. Thank you so much for joining us. Certainly check out that book and her other books. They're all fantastic. I've read them all, every word. The Residence is one, First Women is the next, and then First in Line about vice presidents. She's active on Twitter at Kate Brower. So thank you for being here. We very much appreciate this.
Thank you. And I love your podcast idea and completely agree with you about making history accessible. And so I think that's wonderful.
All right. We got our first endorsement. Thank you for listening. Thanks, Kate, for being here. And thank you for listening to this first episode of Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Twitter and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the shows. We'll have guest announcements on there and book recommendations. So we will see you next time. Thank you.